Hello. Hello, can you hear me? I cannot start my video.
Hello, good evening. Yeah, we can hear you. We can try to fix it.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now you're the co-host, so. Okay.
Now it's cool.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, we can see. Okay. So firstly, if you let me please just to introduce you to our attendants, please. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سيداتي وسادتي، مساء الخير عليكم. أهلا ومرحبا بكم في ندوتنا لهذا اليوم التي تركز على إدارة مخاطر مشاريع البناء. هناك فقط القليل من الأشياء التي تكون محفوفة بالمخاطر كمشاريع البناء، حيث المعدات الثقيلة والطواقم التي تعمل في مواقف محفوفة بالمخاطر ولوجستيات معقدة ومخاطر السلامة وعوامل الخطر التي يجب إدارتها. فكيف ستلتزم بالمهنة الزمنية المحددة بينما أنت تدير كل هذه المخاطر؟ سيتم إلقاء الضوء على مثل هذه الجوانب وأكثر طبعاً بكثير من قبل متحدثنا لهذا اليوم في هذه الندوة، وهو عضو هيئة تدريس في كلية الهندسة المهنية قسم إدارة البناء جامعة زغرب، وهو نائب رئيس الجمعية الدولية لإدارة المشاريع IPMA، وكذلك نتج عن مشاريعه البحثية نشر أكثر من 70 بحثاً وكتاباً. لديه أكثر من 12 عاماً في التدريس وإلقاء المحاضرات والمشاركة في المؤتمرات الدولية والإشراف على العديد من المشاريع في هذا المجال. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our symposium, which focuses on construction risk management. You know, few things are as risky as construction projects. There is heavy equipment, crews working in the precarious situation, and complicated logistics, safety hazards, and risk factors to manage. All of these stuff, you need to manage them and with meeting the deadline. So such aspects and more are going to be shed light on by our speaker, who is a faculty member of civil engineering, construction management department, University of Zgub. He is the vice president of the International Project Management Association. His research projects have resulted in more than 70 publications and books. He has more than 12 years teaching, lecturing, and participating in international conferences while supervising experience on such projects in this field. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Maalden Fookomanović. Welcome, Dr. Maalden.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Samara, right?
Yes, that's true.
Dr. Samara, I see. Thank you so much for having me here.
Sure.
Yeah. So should I share my presentation and start?
Yes, please.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
So thank you for having me here. I will use this hour, 45 minutes, to discuss the risk management practices. I was really well introduced. So I work almost 20 years now in the construction sector. Lately, I worked with oil and gas, especially in scheduling, control, and monitoring of the operations and of the turnaround projects on oil and gas refineries. And personally, I have had quite a great share experience in construction sites. Apart from that, I've been teaching at the University of Zagreb, currently employed as a full professor at the University of Zagreb, and also Besides being interested in project management, I'm interested in BIM, in building information modeling, 3Ds, and how to digitally transform the construction sector. Of course, my first love was project management, and this is why I've ended up in construction. This is why I've ended up on construction sites with people, with organization of large amount of resources. And this is somehow how I was maybe directed in the I would say direction of construction management, right? Of course, besides working at the university and being employed as a consultant on oil and gas and construction sites, I'm well employed by IPMA. IPMA, I'm sure you know of already, is the International Global Association for Project Management. May I say that this is the only association which certifies the performance and the competence of people who are able to demonstrate certain amount of knowledge and tools and methods they acquired throughout their educational personal development in practice. So personally, today I will not talk so much of IPMA of certification, but I will maybe more explain the construction project management and on the focus per se on risk management. I will not show what we did in the oil and gas refineries or at one of the projects we did. I will just show you a small example of how we used risk management in Gantt charts and time management, as this was more designed for the students of the universities. But before heading into the risk and opportunities, risk and threats, I would just like to briefly touch on the definition of project success. So the traditional definition of project success was basically done and it was looked through the angle and I would say optics of the time, cost, and scope, which was developed by Martin Barnes, late Martin Barnes, unfortunately, in the late 1970s. So almost 50 years we have had this time, cost, and scope as the iron triangle of achieving project success. Of course, in some of the industries who are not so digitized or are not so advanced in applying tools and methods in project management, but I would also say who are complex and complicated and volatile and uncertain, such as construction, these triple constraints maybe still remain the ultimate goal. But generally, I think what I have seen is that the industry and the thinking of project managers is shifting towards the future definition of achieving business value of which is looked through the competing constraints, and lately it's also the sustainability and environmental, sustainable, and governmental approach to project success. So at first it was just a minimal PM involvement. Then basically now we have mandatory PM involvement in the approval of project success. The success is not just look as time, cost, and quality. It's also the success and satisfaction of all the stakeholders, the key stakeholders included in the project and interested in the project results. So at first it was just a project manager who got the mandate for delivering the results, but now basically the organizations are involving project management early in and basically involving them into the stake of the final project success once the project is delivered. So it's not just operational. Now operational, it moves, it shifts towards strategic, and from funding organizations, we now have required business knowledge, right? So the planning is not so centralized, it's decentralized. We don't have so many top-down WBS developments, but it's bottom-up, and it's evolving because of the high technical innovation and high demand of new projects. Also, the constraints are not just time, cost, and scope. It's going into the competition, into the market, into the competing constraints where risk and uncertainty has a great deal of influence, right? So it's not just the time, cost, and scope. Of course, it needs to remain, but it's also creation of the business value, right? So it's a business value for the client, it's business value for the investing organizations with possible continuing improvement loops. So I would say that even in construction, which is really straightforward industry, it's really down to earth from leadership authority and centralized autocracy type of leadership model. Now we switch more into participatory and collaborative kinds of leadership, right? So nowadays we have a mandatory customer involvement. We have a mandatory responsibility for the market success of the project results. Basically, this means that client needs to give the high level of trust to the project management team. It needs to be rapidly improved, and basically for you who are now participating and viewing this presentation, it also means that you continually need to improve your efforts, your knowledge, your competences, right? So basically, projects are investment life cycles endeavors. The life cycle of the investments go through phases, and project managers are now being involved in this final stake and interests of the client. So previously we had this iron triangle: time, cost, and scope. Of course, risk and risk management was always part of that scope, right? Always. But now scope and cost and time are more coming into the second row, and in the first row there is value, quality, image, reputation, which becomes part of the responsibility and even accountability of the project manager. Of course, one can argue now, how can I be responsible? How can I be held accountable for the final outcome of the product and its success on the market if I wasn't involved at the beginning during the conception phase of the project? And this is basically where I would like to put my emphasis of this lecture, is that project managers need to be early involved, earlier the better, into the conception phase, inception of the whole project, to be able to share their risks and share the final result, right? So this is basically what is accepted. This triangle is basically what is expected from the client. And I'm afraid that this version 1.0, while this was 2.0, this version 1.0 is still maybe something which is eminent and usual in the construction sector, right? But risk and opportunity, of course, it's not just risks. According to the IPMA ICB 4.0 standard. Risk and opportunity includes, of course, the identification, definition, assessment, planning of the responses and mitigation, and then measuring, monitoring, and controlling the risks and opportunities around the projects. But the long-term success of the organization relies on many things, from continually assessing and updating, offering to optimize and optimizing their processes. And even if this weren't enough of a challenge, we also need to account for the unexpected managing risks. So risk and opportunity include this identification of both pluses and minuses for the projects. Of course, it's always the uncertainty around the possible outcomes of an uncertain and probable event. So risk and opportunity management helps decision maker, right, and decision makers to make informed choices, to make decisions, to prioritize actions, and I would say distinguished amongst alternative courses of action. So it's an ongoing process rather than just being one point at a time, right? Of course, I don't have time, or it's the scope of this presentation now to go in detail in all of the steps and processes. I will just use the 6 step usually, which are basically handled through a regular risk management process, such as planning, identification, analysis, qualitative and quantitative risk response planning, and then monitoring control. But I will try to at least provide you with the, I would say, elementary and rudimentary methods of keeping the risks in place. Risk is not just associated with project management. ISO, for example, the International Organization for Standardization, they have 35,000 standard, which clearly standardizes and defines risk management practices. So, of course, the whole risk management originates from the banking, financing, and insurance sector. But now in project management, I think it's gone the furthest in construction management because of the high complexity of construction projects. So from one side, we have the upside risks, which is the opportunity, right? The potential gains, the potential opportunities for the client and the team in projects, but we also have the downside risks, which usually are perceived as risks, right? People don't usually think of the upside opportunities. And according to research, it's been found many times that the upside risks are usually the key success factors of successful teams and organizations and people who focus on the upside risks achieve the best outcomes. The downside risks, of course, are usually measured in money, are measured sometimes in time, and basically they reflect the chance that the actual event may be different than the plan. So what is important and what is the real traditional and conventional, I would say, definition of the risk is that we have the likelihood, this is the L, and the consequences. Of course, it's very hard to measure likelihood in projects which are unique, which are one-time endeavors and not easily repeatable in all of the circumstances. But organizations and project teams and PMOs, project management offices, that is, can measure and track and register risks into their own databases and use these databases to identify risk better. Of course, you will see throughout the organization, throughout the presentation, traditional matrices of how to then use this likelihood and consequence in assessing the risks. And for now, I will just explain the process and then the steps, and we will return to this formula you just have seen on the impact of risks. So usual risk management process that at least I have had a lot to do with and have experience in implementing usually starts off by risk management identification, which is, I would say, the hardest part. So this is basically the hardest part. And since projects are unique and one-time opportunities, of course, in some cases they are repeatable, it's very hard to foresee what might happen in the near future. So if we talk about repeatable events, about probable events such as tides or wind of earthquakes or similar events, then we can talk about some statistical past data. But if we are talking about, for example, delayed because of low quality of the design specification in construction projects, then it's really hard to identify risks without, I would say, thorough business intelligence and thorough registers, which you can use to help identify risks. Of course, it's not just the risk identification, it's also gathering techniques, brainstorming, Delphi techniques of experts who can then identify from their own experience, right? The next phase is risk analysis and evaluation, where basically probable events needs to be evaluated on how much pluses or minuses that I would say benefit or negative outcome they would yield in projects, and if they were to happen, what you will do about it. So that's a risk response. What is very important to note is that all of the three steps here are just the planning phase of risk management, which happens into the planning phase of the project. So if you were to look at the project life cycle, before the handout, before the delivery, before going into the execution, the planning, at least in my experience, and what I believe is that the planning phase is maybe the most important one. All of these things need to be identified at the very beginning and then monitored and controlled throughout the execution. So basically, the majority of international standards usually look at the risk management into planning, identification, analysis, which can be qualitative or quantitative, risk response planning, and monitoring and control. So basically, this is not nothing scientific, nothing research now for further research, but this is something which is really standardized and explained in international standards, but also in professional guidelines. So after the initial risk management planning basically was done and designed, we need to basically have a risk management approach or a plan. This is the first step, which would then explain and define the processes set forth by the initial phase, which I just showed on the slides before of the whole process. Usually, this management planning is done from the PMO level, from the organization, and not, I would say, specifically and particularly per project per se. The next phase is risk identification, where you basically look at the process assets, scope statement, risk management plan, but also gathering technique, interviewing, strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats analysis, known as SWOTs, and risk registers, which you need to basically look at when identifying the risks. The project I worked on in construction was basically the latest big risks. That risk that basically was triggered was that one of the construction factory, the concrete factories, the contractor did not look at the risks and the quality of that concrete factory, and the concrete which was delivered to the construction site was of bad quality, which was noticed only 20 days after the concrete was embedded. So therefore, the two levels of this huge touristic compound had to be completely demolished because of the bad quality. Of course, when you surveyed and talked to the locals at the construction sites and the companies living in that area, they all knew about the quality issues of that concrete factory, but this was really overlooked by the main contractor. So identification, this is why I said it's maybe the hardest part, because identification maybe usually we say 3 or 4 big risks are enough. You don't need to focus on 50, 60, which come from the literature, but the 3-4 main risks should be enough. Usually companies have risk breakdown structures. It's not just work breakdown structures, where they look at the legislation, technical organization, project management, and then they go and look into different registers. And all of these internal standards, and I would say their experience-based registries of risk are of the biggest importance, I would say, to the risk risk identification. Of course, if we go into the Delphi technique, brainstorming, usually what we do is go through the root trees, such as Ishikawa or fish bones, and trying to think of the sources, of the triggers, of the risks, consequence itself, and then how to mitigate, and what are the residual risks that are left off from when the risk triggers. Where it all goes down is risk registries and risk maps, who then basically have the lists of identified risks, potential responses, root causes, and then basically this is a baseline set forth in the planning phase to measure and manage and control the risks throughout the project. Once the risks are identified, then basically we go then into the qualitative risk analysis, where these previously identified risks are then trying to be measured. Well, from 1950s, in the last, I would say, 70 years, there have been methods and tools how to quantify the level of uncertainty of risks. From my experience, this is quite hard in construction. One thing is in banking or insurance sector, where you have a big amount of databases and clients and repeatable actions, while in construction, every, I would say, endeavor, every investment is an animal. It's even for a universe for itself. So it's just a matter how you measure the uncertainty, whether you use statistics and probability curves, which is then quantitative risk analysis, or you say, I'm not able to measure something in a quantitative way. I would just use a scale of, for example, 1 to 5, and then try to assess the impact of each of the risks. So basically, the risk breakdown structure, once the risks are identified, then usually if you just focus on the threats, instead of providing a continuous probability curve, this probability is then usually divided in this case into 5 different levels. Each company has their own internal standards, usually I always suggest companies to use an even number, 4 or 6 or 8 of probability, because then it's very hard. Once you give them an odd number, then people tend to use the neutral way, right? So usually, I usually advise people to use an even number of probability levels. Threats, as the same as the probability, go on this axis and probability on this axis. And of course, if you remember from the slide before, it's likelihood multiplied by consequences. So here you have the consequences or impacts, and here you have the probability. So what you can see from this then matrix is basically the different areas or zones of risk impact, right? So or here's an example of another impact scale and the probability scale, which also has some qualitative description to each of the levels and each of the description marks given to each grade. So this is why this analysis is called qualitative risk analysis. The other way when you can find raw data, where you can find repeatable actions, then you can focus on the quantitative risk analysis. But this also means that according to some very, I would say, big amount of time in the past, you've been measuring the same event continuously, and now you have a big frequency of occurring events, right? This can be really easily identified in earthquake, in structural analysis, but when it comes to market, when it comes to the prices, which nowadays are completely wild, and for example, the price of iron it went from 100% to 200, 300, and fell to 75%. It's very hard to keep track on the frequencies of how the market prices or other similar risks are behaving in the market. So this is why I say it's always be careful not to use quantitative analysis just because it looks fancy and nice. There are many software applications who are providing tools and methods of how to apply such certainties to projects, whether it's in calculation, whether it's in scheduling, but please be careful that once you put the garbage in as input data, be careful that the results, the data from the analysis will also be not that useful, because it always can look really nice on paper, but in the end, whether it's useful, it's the only measure of success. For example, we usually used projects and the schedule, where it was asked by, sorry, this is in Croatian because it was done for a construction company in Croatia, that we focused on some of the activities which had the minimum duration, most likely duration, and maximum duration, and tried to then iterate during using the Monte Carlo approach on every possible outcome of the project, and then we came to the all the possible outcomes of the projects once we had implemented the uncertainty in the duration of each of the tasks. And what we basically saw at that time is that the initial schedule, the initial deadline that we calculated with, was only less than 20% certain that we will make it on time. And basically, if we wanted to have a 85% of certainty, we had to basically shift the deadline forward. Of course, this was then looked through the iron triangle of value, success on the market, client specification and client needs, of course, because every product, every delivery of that project needs to be looked through this new iron triangle, where the final product is being assessed through the lens of the market success. Of course, you can use the very same uncertainty and frequency, statistical frequency Monte Carlos in cost estimation error. This graph only shows how at the initial planning, which let's say called at the point A, and then budget planning at point B, and then the final design, point C. At the final design, you still have 80% of the error. And this is done on more than 20,000 projects, infrastructure around the world, the research. In the budget, before the final design, you still have 35% of the error of estimating the final costs, while at the beginning in the conception, usually you can encounter almost 100% of an error in the final estimation. This is, for example, why in the UK they have probability curves where they don't just use the initial estimation when assessing the final investments of the projects, but they are basically increasing the final investment, so they somehow come to a more reasonable estimates on which they will use to decide. Of course, you can use the very same technique. I really simplified because usually it's done through software on how this probability can be then connected to the building costs, where you have optimistic outcome, likely outcome, and pessimistic outcome. Usually this method is called the Perth method, where basically then you ponder each, you have weights in the probability and ponders for each of the building costs, right? So if you look at the three analysis of building a hotel annex of a futuristic compound, then you can basically weigh in the new hotel annex or upgrade with a strong demand, weak demand of each of the alternatives. Of course, this is the iron triangle where you have to look at the value. So this is the value you need to look at. It's not only the time, costs, and quality for the delivery to the client. Nowadays, we are asked to be involved completely at the beginning in the inception by thinking of for the success of the organization on the market. So each decision, I would say, maybe bigger decision or high decision you take needs to be looked through the success of the final product on the market. As for the for example, what we did also this part was for oil and gas creation is for the CBA, so cost benefit analysis, where we look at different. This is in thousands of euros of US dollars. I'm sorry, and where we looked how much income would be coming from each of the revenue streams, and basically how probable these incomes were, and what is our break-even point, and how probable that break-even is to happen in 8 years. So this is where it all comes down, and it's in my experience, it's not the method, it's not the mathematics or the software which is the problem, it's how to identify and how to assess the real risks. Once you have identified the risks and you have analyzed their magnitude and their probability and the consequence, then you need to plan the risk response. So please mind that all of these phases, which are now in red, are still in the planning phase. We still haven't gone to the monitoring and control, that is to the execution. So basically the risk register once put to the plan, where you set up the risk register in the I would say step 0, then you use the risk register to update as the process goes. So the risk register, basically, for example, for risk 1 or risk 2 or risk 5, has its likelihood, consequence, of course, what is multiplied, the zone of the level of risk magnitude. It was put to orange, to yellow, to green, and the basically mitigation. Of course, you can avoid, you can transfer, you can mitigate or accept negative risk. With positive risks or opportunities, you can exploit, you can share, you can enhance, accept. And the positive risks are usually connected to the stakeholders and to involving the stakeholders who can help you out and make your project a stronger case. But this is well explained in the IPMA ICB 4 standard, where stakeholders are the, I would say, integral part of risk management. Also regarding the mitigation strategies on how to avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept, please always keep in mind that if you transfer the risk on the side who is not able or competent to manage that risks, then this risk will double fire, backfire back to you. So just transferring the risk to the stakeholder or to your partner who is not being able to manage risk is not that wise unless the person is competent, right? And the last phase, of course, is monitoring and controlling, based on monitoring the execution, and if a risk trigger emerges and risk triggers, then basically the plan mitigation strategies are then employed. Of course, this is not all. This was just explained for the project level. The whole risk management nowadays are looked on the enterprise level as a risk management for planning, preparation, and the resilience of the whole organization. So this planning step 0, which I just talked about, is based, in my personal view, would just be in a portfolio management activity, not that particular to a certain project. And we need to understand that there are not only project risks, but there are also program risks and the strategic organizational risks from investing in a project, right? So all these things needs to be really looked up on and considered with making a choice and a decision. At the end of this presentation, I will just briefly touch back to the case of constructing a Terminal 5 in London of Heathrow, right? Where basically this project, this Terminal 5, an annex of London Main Airport, is one of the I would say example of good practices where they achieved the time, the costs, and the quality, and they didn't breach the budget, and they didn't breach the costs. And the key success factor of why they did so yielded such a good success was that they focused on the risk management. And Terminal 5 is, I would say, a showcase example of how risk management really works. It was an investment of 4.3 billion of pounds, which equals about to 5.5 billion of US dollars. And basically, when you look at, they had 20,000 of suppliers, 60 different contractors, and which they couldn't have managed in an autocratic and top-down, very directive mode. What they used is they basically were managing risks and transferring risks on the lower levels and trying to manage the project in this way. So the Heathrow 5 is one of the mostly discussed programs of all time, I would say, in the literature, right? And to look closely at the factors which contribute to Heathrow Terminal 5 success in the next part of this essay, risk and uncertainty management, I'll discuss how they focused on the 4 levels, 4 tiers of suppliers, and how they make decisions by tiers of suppliers, right? So basically, they had a proper risk management strategy as a key factor, where the lower levels of uncertainty, they understood that the lower levels of uncertainty contribute to successful accomplishment of their projects. Of course, this involved variability and the number of risks, and they understood that the effective risk management strategies would have influenced the whole uncertainty of the project, right? So apart from that risk management strategy, they try to aggregate the supplies risks by, I would say, delegating risks to the lower levels of suppliers. They had altogether 4 levels of tiers of suppliers. So they focus especially on the governance risks, on the project processes risks, on the project management risks, and then logistics, just-in-time logistics, pre-assembly, and prefabrication and modular parts of the terminal, and then risks of test and commission and handover. So basically, they had established a project governance of 4 levels, and then they separately focused on the 4 levels of risk management, right? So the first tier of suppliers had 60 different suppliers, and then the second tier had subcontractors. Of course, this was left off this T5 Terminal 5 agreement was left only for the first tier of suppliers, which then controlled the second tiers of suppliers, while the governance was done by the British Airways. The main focus was on scheduling and keeping the time and keeping the deadline, and this is usually by all of the, I would say, research and my personal experience is that the clients are always focused mostly on the time and achieving that deadline. So they focus on continuous loops of planning, doing, checking, and acting, which is mostly known as a PDCA, Deming cycle. Of course, I'm sure you're aware of the agile approaches and the agile project management, where they do in sprints and try to constantly plan, do, check, and act. And usually in the literature, you can see that maybe construction is not so well founded for the agile approaches, but I would argue just the opposite, where construction is very agile, but not maybe in the phases aspect, on the phases level, but within each of the phases we have many plan, do's, checks, and acts, and sprints. For example, they use critical chain technique. So it's not critical path, but critical chain, where they pushed and forced all of the activities from the Gantt chart to be looked upon and considered as critical. So they put all the activities in the schedule as critical, and the ones that were not critical before that action, their buffer, their lag, their float was put to the very end. So basically, they just look at the final buffer consumption of the time, and they consider each activity to be critical. So in this way, they put some additional pressure to the contractor, and they just looked at the axis of buffer consumption. So how much time is left for us to be late on each of the activities and still make it on time, and how far did we progress in the project. So for example, if they were here, where this X marks the spot, so they would have progressed 50 to 60% of the project, and they would spend 50%, 60% of the buffer of time, which is which was really good. Of course, if they were here in red, this would mean that they only have maybe 10% of the buffer left, while they achieved only 50%. So then they had to go to the tiers, and then they had to go to the different level of responsibility and check and monitor the risks. So this is basically maybe a showcase example of Terminal 5 in London, which really focused in construction management on risks and which really helped them to achieve this success. So basically, when you think on, 2 weeks ago, I had with one global player positioned in Paris, in France. We had a global customer meeting, and they said it's an IT company, and they said that almost 50% of their investments now are projects. So you know that projects are always something which brings a change and transition endeavors. They bring a new product, new service, or they bring an improved product, improved service. So it's always a change. And when you think of this 50%, it's a really high pressure and gradient of development and influence of project management in nowadays modern companies. According to current research, it's about 32%. Fortune magazine and Harvard Business Review found that 32% of global economy is handled through projects. So this is quite a big amount of development we are currently facing, but also big amount of risks we are really facing today with these new projects, endeavors, and high amount of development. So unless you can measure something, it's really hard to understand. And if you cannot understand something, it's really hard to control and mitigate. And this is what is always so evident with risks. People don't like to pay upfront for the risks because people are in their nature very optimistic and think that the risks wouldn't happen to them. But if you start systematically measuring, registering, and trying to identify some of the projects' risks, then you will make a database registered for the future risks to come, and which would be a great help, a great aid for the future endeavors and future investments. So thank you for listening to this presentation, for this brief explanation of risk management, according also to my experience and according to the contemporary literature. And I will now hand it off to our host for any questions or discussion. Thank you.
Professor, can we have some questions? Students, if you have questions, we are listening.
Yusuf, there are so many questions in the chat. Maybe if you can, if there are some questions I can answer, or if they're not, also good. But if you can just facilitate this, I cannot handle so many chat messages.
I can ask you later by email.
Okay, cool.
I think we have come to the end of our symposium. Thank you, Professor Maalden Fokoumanouich, Vice President of IBMA, for your informative presentation. It was a pleasure to have you with us. So this concluded our symposium. Thank you all for attending. We hope that you have learned and enjoyed. Stay safe and goodbye. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your presence.
Thank you, Yusuf, very much for having me. It was my pleasure, and wishing you all the success in your future work and life. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.